Conscient Podcast, Episode 179. Artist, writer, and environmental communications specialist Katrine Claassens and engineer and science communicator Sébastian méric de Bellefon.
I luckily managed to move from a space of, this is something we've spoken about, I have to save the planet or else, and we can talk a little bit about that world save, to I choose to commit my life to climate change in the best way I can, because everything that matters to me in this world stands to be lost in a climate crisis, especially one that would play out in a very severe and apocalyptic way. And
having this, I would say, calm perspective from artists, helping us get in touch with our feelings, simply, I found it to be a stabilizing force.
This is a special episode of the Conscient Podcast featuring two guests, one from the arts and another from the sciences, over a glass of wine or two. Katrine Claassens is an artist, writer, and environmental communications specialist. She has a master's degree in climate change from the University of Cape Town in South Africa and an honors degree in visual art from Stellenbosch University. Katrine's work reflects her interest in climate change, deep ecology, urban ecology, and internet memes. As an artist, she has led workshops, given public lectures, and curated exhibitions all over the world, from the Arctic to the Antarctic. And as a climate communication specialist, Katrine works with governments, think tanks, academia, and NGOs to navigate complex and shifting landscapes. But I would say first and foremost, Katrine is an artist and an activist and a climate leader, for that matter. Now, Sébastian méric de Bellefon is an engineer with a background in software development. He has a master's degree in electrical engineering from the Institut Supérieur d'Électronique de Paris and a master's degree in biochemistry and genetics from Université de Montréal. After working in other industries as a software developer and consultant, banking, online radio, healthcare, and so on, he met Katrine and became a nerd about all things related to climate science and decarbonization pathways. 3 years ago, he started a new career path writing software for clean energy companies, first at General Power Systems to create virtual power plants, and now at Power Factors to streamline the operations of wind and solar farms. Now, I first met Katrine at an online creative climate leadership alumni meeting, and that course is one I took in March of 2020, and it's organized by Julie's Bicycle in the UK. And Katrine and I were on a breakout session, and she mentioned that she had immigrated to Canada from South Africa and, like myself, was an art and climate activist. And so we met in Montreal, and I met her husband Sébastian. We had a delicious vegan meal where at the end of the meal, I asked them if they would be willing to record a Conscient Podcast episode, and they kindly agreed. So we talked for an hour while drinking a bottle of homemade dandelion wine. There were very many interesting moments in our conversation, including when Katrine talked about her work on social media's representation of nature.
Right now, my practice is looking a lot at the internet and memes and how nature is consumed or understood or contextualized through TikTok videos and YouTube videos and memes on Instagram.
And interestingly, at the end, I was surprised, but I had a déjà vu. Some of you might remember this CBC radio program, Brave New Waves.
And Claude Schreier, who is a Franco-Ontarian.
Mm-hmm. Born in Ottawa, raised in North Bay.
Oh, that's interesting. Most people do it the other way around, don't they?
I didn't have much choice. It's actually nice.
Which was broadcast at night nationally on CBC radio from Montreal.
Claude got into music through instinct. Comes from a background of hunters and fishermen and outdoorsmen.
Alan Conter was one of the initial producers, and Augusta Lepay was one of the hosts.
Let's play this. We love this title here on Brave New Waves. Al and I were listening to, Al was listening to the piece, but he said, this one's called Divertimento for Latecomers. And we said, oh, what a great title.
It has to be.
And it just reminded me of those times, the dinner we had in Montreal, a long, winding conversation with a bit of wine, and exchanges about what we cared about and what was happening in our lives. Here we go. Conscient podcast. I am with some new friends, Katrine Claassens, did I get that right?
Yeah.
And Sébastian Méric de Bellefon. C'est bien ça? Bienvenue, both of you. A bit of context for listeners. I'm involved in a number of networks, and one of them is a creative climate leadership. Of course, I did in 2020, and I've talked about it in previous, and Alison Tickell's in episode 3, and blah, blah, blah. And I met Katrine online just a few weeks ago at a networking session for the climate leadership, and we've both taken a similar course in climate leadership, and people from all around the world have done it, including here in Canada. And Sébastian is Katrine's partner, and we've just spent like a couple of hours talking about art and science and climate and life with a little bit of wine and
Dandelion wine.
And what's fun is just to take a moment to record and to share part of our conversation. We can't possibly share it all, but it's a way also of getting to know both of you through a conversation, and to share some of the things that we're thinking about, and some of the things that we're not sure about, and that kind of thing. So why don't we start with just a quick introduction of each of you, what your background is. And I know you're both from other countries, relatively recent immigrants to Canada. All that's interesting. Your relationship to art, that kind of thing. And then we'll just talk about what we usually talk about, which is art and the ecological crisis. But because you, Katrine, have a background both in science and art, that's very interesting. And because you, Sébastian, are more coming from the sciences, but are very much, involved in the arts because you're married to an artist. What can you do, right? There's that connection there, as well as being somebody who's very specialized in a particular type of environmental science, which I'm really interested in. Just earlier this evening, you corrected me on some of my misgivings about veganism and this and that, and I think we should always listen to people who have a little bit more knowledge and are willing to not so much correct us, but give us an alternative way of thinking about it, and all of a sudden you go, that makes sense. So Katrine, why don't you start?
Thank you so much for having me, Claude. I studied art and practiced as an artist for around 10 years before watching a movie called The Road, which is based on a book by Cormac McCarthy, also called The Road. I watched this film, and then I watched it again, and I sat down, and this must have been around 2013. I don't remember sitting in front of the television like that, rewinding and rewatching and rewinding and rewatching. Then I had before, apart from 9/11. It was just this. It was kind of like, the way we were attached to the news during the pandemic. It was kind of like that. I watched it again and again and again and again. And something deeply changed in me. And I did a bit of work with other people. I moved into this kind of this space that a lot of activists get into when they first learn about climate change. What can I do? I would kill myself to stop this problem. I would do anything for this. I will give up everything I have in my life. I will do whatever this is. And I luckily managed to move from a space of, this is something we've spoken about, I have to save the planet or else, and we can talk a little bit about that world save, to I choose to commit my life to climate change in the best way I can, because everything that matters to me in this world stands to be lost in a climate crisis, especially one that would play out in a very severe and apocalyptic way. And that was this thing I took out from the road. So the road showed a world where absolutely everything was dead except humans, a couple of dogs, and the bacteria that we have in our guts. And communities, families, wildlife, everything destroyed. And I thought, what would I want? I wouldn't want to live in that world. And it showed me a vision of what that could look like. So I went and studied a very interesting master's degree, interdisciplinary master's degree at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And there I learned a lot about climate science and all the other aspects of climate. We always talk about climate science, but there's law, there's policy, there's all kinds of interesting things, sociology, all very interesting things coming together. Did this degree, and since then I've been working at the kind of climate and economics and climate and policy nexus, where those things come across, intersect, and also working as an artist. So carrying on my artistic practice, but it's informed in a different way, and I'm working with different people than I did before. So that is where I find myself now, and I'll allow Sébastian to introduce himself.
So my background is fairly different. I started with a career in engineering, electronics, and I've been working as an engineer since then. And I was in the middle of trying to find more meaning in my career, and I decided to go into medical research, studying genetics here in Montreal. And then I was lucky enough to meet Katrine here, who told me about climate change, and I had greatly underestimated how serious it was. I was really ignorant about it. And I had a couple of really difficult months about it. I started reading the literature, trying to get a sense for myself of what was going on, the severity of it, the timeline, the impact, and also about the solution of spaces. I was really interested in actually finding solutions, even if it's just potential, what can we do about this? So I decided to switch careers again and move into clean energy, which was pretty good match with me having some experience in software, also understanding electronics, power systems to a certain degree. So it just made sense, and I found my new career, and I have been working in this field for 3 years now, and I have become a nerd about everything related to climate solutions and science. I try to get up to date about whatever happens in my space, what's related to energy, but also a bit of agriculture, social systems, policies, etc. Just trying to learn as much as possible to let's say, find a bit of optimism in a difficult situation.
Well, put you on the spot because it's, why not?
Why not?
What about how then does art inform your work, or how does it cohabitate with your work as a scientist?
It mostly doesn't. It has inspired me to get more in touch in my feelings, not only knowing what is at stake, what is going to be lost or not, but get in touch with my feelings, and I would say find the motivation to persevere in that direction, just not giving up. It can take a lot of energy. As soon as you enter this space, you can get overwhelmed quite easily with the magnitude of the task, with how many people are trying to prevent us from making things better. It's huge, and it can feel overwhelming for anyone, even people working in an organization. So having this, I would say, calm perspective from artists, helping us get in touch with our feelings, simply, I found it to be a stabilizing force.
Calm or not so calm, because some artists are pushing the panic button, and rightfully so. And earlier, Katrine, you were talking about that art and science in a way are the same thing, or I don't know exactly how you say it. And my father was a doctor, my mother was an artist. To me, it was all interconnected, and it is, because aesthetically, the experiential, exploratory nature of science and exploratory nature of art have similar methodologies, but very different methodologies, especially in Western science versus all of the art practices in the world. But what did you mean by that?
When art and science are at their best, they're so similar. And when they're at their worst, they tend to be a little bit more more different and have like a different impact. But when you're looking at scientists doing, I'd never read a scientific paper before I started doing my master. I'd never looked at that. And I always had this, everything that is scientific is, it's just, you can't touch it, right? It's science. And whereas art, you have a painting and people can go, this is terrible, this is good, or it moves me, or it doesn't, or whatever. It felt more vulnerable, and science felt like something that one couldn't really pick at. That was my perspective as an artist. When you move into the more realm of the science world, you look at a lot of people picking apart each other's arguments. We just don't always feel that we have the authority to do so. But once you have that degree, that kind of education, you can. Does that answer your question? I'm not actually sure it does.
Well, it's a very big question. It's like an existential question. What is life? What is love? What is knowledge? These things can go on for a long time. But I guess I'd like to hear about your art practice, how you, not so much define it, but how you describe the type of work you do and why you do it. I've seen some of the videos and visual art and that, but just tell me more about your art practice and maybe your process in creation and what you're trying, not so much what you're trying to achieve, but what your relationships are in your art practice.
To be completely vulnerable here, my art practice is in a place of a lot of flux right now as I look at all the things that are coming with me as an artist. Earlier, you and I were talking about how there's a fantastic book. It's called The Success and Failure of Picasso. It's by John Berger. And one of the things he looks at is where does Picasso succeed and where does Picasso fail as an artist? And his conclusion is that Picasso fails as an artist when he stops asking questions and starts giving people answers. And I think that might be something that is true for a lot of artists. And we're not talking necessarily about really literal questions. So you don't go to an exhibition called Climate Change is Wrong, and we, it's not like that, but there's something in it which can be prescriptive or didactic or whatever. And I'm in a place right now where I have a lot of questions. So if I look back a little bit further at my work, I'm a painter. I paint in oil. And my journey into the world of climate change and my art started a lot with looking at suburbs as places of unequal trespassers. So I was looking at animals coming into suburban spaces and suburban spaces moving into wilder spaces. So looking at deer, looking at foxes, looking at the large fauna that sometimes occupy the same space as we do in surprising ways. And after my degree, I was invited on a research ship that was going to a very isolated and unstudied area in Antarctica during a very special time of the year to see how ice was formed in this particular area. And from then on, I've kind of worked with scientists, artists, to probably in a more collaborative way. I think that's one thing I've taken away from the climate. Well, a lot of artists are like lone wolves. We're doing our own thing. We have our own vision. But I found that my work has been greatly enriched by working with more people. Right now, my practice is looking a lot at the internet and memes and how nature is consumed or understood or contextualized through TikTok videos and YouTube videos and memes on Instagram. Like how are we talking about nature and climate change? And the internet plays a huge role in that.
And there's a playful side to that, I assume, right? Because memes are a type of satire, they're a type of parody, they're a type of working through things that we're scared of, humor as a way of,
and they're contagious and repeatable, and you can riff off them.
And they're constantly being reinterpreted.
Yeah.
And I mean, they can be also misleading, but then if you know you're being misled, then you're not being misled. You're just following a path, and you go, oh, okay, that was fun. I'm not going to go there again or whatever. So I'm interested in that. Well, the question of I'm getting tired of asking the question, what is the role of art in the climate and the ecological crisis, because I've heard a lot of the same answers, which is that artists do what artists do, and many of them are concerned about many interconnected social issues. So some will work at a social justice issue, which is connected to the ecological crisis because it's one of the causes of the ecological crisis. Somebody else will look at the effects of autism on education or whatever the topic. I'm just making this up. Yeah. And I, when my earlier days, I thought we need more climate art, right? And when we did the climate leadership, the intention was to have more leadership around climate arts. But what is climate arts? Is it yet another silo? Is it another, specialized way to address? Or is it more like a movement of awareness and engagement around the issues that surround us, with the climate emergency being the most urgent, but in a way it's a symptom of a larger disconnect with the planet, and we're getting there. I'm hearing again and again here in Montreal. Just this weekend I spent time with the choral community, and they're understanding that as choralists, as musicians, as singers, they have a role to play. They're already doing it. They just need to do further and reach out for new partners and maybe sing slightly different songs, or maybe sing less, or whatever it is that will get them better connected with this moment, with the challenges that we face, without panicking, with all the strength and confidence of an artist, right? So I don't know where I'm going with that, though.
I think there's something, it's so interesting you say we've asked this question a lot. Climate art, how boring.
We're drinking tea here, that's why it's making sound, but I'm a soundscape guy, so it's all good. Well, how is it boring?
I think, I worked on a research project at the University of Cape Town that we spoke about earlier, and what was so interesting about this project was that it was one of the earlier projects, not the earliest, but one of the earlier projects that took climate change and looked at gender and climate change, and politics and climate change, and all the little children and climate, all these little things. Like, we're all in it right now. And I remember when I first kind of woke up to climate change, I was like, how can anyone be not talking about only this all the time? I was like, I'd look at people making stuff about, I don't know, I think it was, I don't know, and I was just like, that's dumb. How could they even think about, women's rights when we're looking at the climate crisis, which is going to just kill us all? Like, we're looking into the face of extinction. We're looking in, if not extinction, then, a lot of other the collapse of our society, everything that well, we don't want to keep everything, but we're looking at the collapse of a lot of things that are good. We're looking at refugees. We're looking at just this terrible thing. How could you talk about women's rights at a point like this? Screw that. Even as a feminist.
Not talk about women's rights?
And here's the thing: when we do that, oh my word! It's this thing about we're in it. We're all in it right now. This is not a future event. We're in it, and all of this stuff is connected, and all of this stuff will be focused and is brought in and will be affected and can affect change in itself, right? So it's never just about climate change, and it's a deep failure of creativity when we think it is. And we were talking about the communication of climate change. One of the criticisms was that it was, framed as a scientific issue. Like, who has the authority, to speak on this? But actually, it's everyone, everything, all the time.
I have a question for Sébastian, but before I do that, I want to tell you, you can put the microphone his way. I want to tell you I have a massive déjà vu. In the 80s here in Montreal, there was a program called Brave New Waves. Alan Conter and Auguste Lepay, and you don't know these people, but they're pioneers in this nighttime radio show where at the time CBC radio wasn't broadcasting all 24 hours, so these brilliant producers said, why don't we do an arts and cultural show from like midnight to 5 in the morning? And so they'd have cases of wine, and then they'd invite a collected group of people, and I was on the show 3 or 4 times, and it was so good. And it feels like that now, because we're sitting around drinking tea, we're a bit tired, it's late at night, this kind of stuff. We're babbling on, but it's like live radio where you don't care because what you just said is gone anyway, right? And and so you speak your mind, and people might or might not connect. They might be half asleep, But that's my déjà vu, is a bit of a nostalgia as well.
Fortunately, the internet.
Well, never forgets unless I erase it. But my point is that it's like live radio where you can you can slow down a bit, and you can say, if you're interested, you tune in. Might tune in, tune out. But there's an informality to it that's very refreshing, because it's not performative, right? It's not like you prepared, and you didn't even know you're going to be interviewed, Sebastian, so you're just sitting there going, what the hell am I going to say to these arts people? But it's interesting to have these kinds of dialogues all the time, at dinner parties and at work, so that we can feel free to express our vulnerabilities, be right, be wrong, not be sure, empathize with somebody's anxiety or grief, be joyful, all those things, and then see and feel the bigger picture that, somebody today was saying, if you connected all the little initiatives that are going around the farming communities, all of the collectives, it's tremendously powerful. Right, it really is. This isn't sort of hopey stuff. It's like we are very powerful, and we are on a moment of change, except that we're so ingrained in this extractive capitalist system, which is self-destructive. It has some merit, but really mostly it's like not good. So I believe in that those connections can be made, and they can be made regionally, nationally, internationally, and even beyond that in the cosmos, and to dream and to allow ourselves to be in a space of possibility while still very much grounded in the reality. Like, we're in a very difficult situation where a lot of people are suffering, a lot of people are dying, and we're in a very privileged place here in Canada at this time. Could change tomorrow, but right now we're in an extremely privileged place. So what are we doing? How are we living? Who are we working with? What are kinds of issues? So my question for you is, how do you feel, Sebastian?
Well, very ambivalent. It feels like a race. We are very short on time, for sure. But things are happening at an increasingly fast pace and showing the limit of our capacity to adapt. But at the same time, solutions are appearing. very quickly. I'm very lucky to work in clean energy now, so I'm connected to what's happening in that space and to fields that are adjacent to it. And things are also improving exponentially in a way that would surprise a lot of people. A lot of what we consider problematic is basically obsolete now. If you tell people, hey, oil as a fossil fuel is obsolete today, they would be surprised. And there is so much work to be done, of course, to accelerate the change. But it is obsolete. It's a zombie, and the consequences of this have not been measured properly. I'm thinking about a friend met at university from Algeria. It's a country with poor governance, and it's a country that's heavily dependent on oil exports. And it's a hot country. It's going to be terrible for them. They are unprepared. They're unlikely to adapt adequately to what's coming. Maybe in 10, 15, 20 years, they will lose their main source of income. What's going to happen to them? It's not just about climate impact, it's also about geopolitical impact that we are not prepared for. So feeling a lot of empathy for everyone who is going to be impacted in a way or another. That's hundreds of millions of people who will be deeply impacted or more.
And it sounds like you want to help with solutions. I don't like the word solutions because it sounds simplistic, as if there was one solution. And I am a bit skeptical about certain green technologies. I'm learning more. But for instance, I had a conversation with colleagues the other day about artificial intelligence, you know, and they're all excited about it. And they're thinking there's this new thing that just came out and it's even faster. And I said, why? No, what I said is, do we have a sustainable framework for artificial intelligence, knowing how in energy and technological, do we have any idea? Is there ever a preface that says we have to reduce our use of technology? It is useful, but let's not go 100,000 miles an hour. Let's go quite a bit slower. And I know that they're trying to control AI and all. I'm not talking about that so much, though that's part of it. I'm talking about the realistic resources that are being extracted from countries that are already, being exploited by labor practices. Are we going to go further and get even more minerals to accelerate artificial intelligence that we might or might not need? We haven't even had time to think about it. So how do you feel about that?
Right. Well, I just saw a few numbers related to this. Microsoft, which is investing in artificial intelligence like so many companies now, had I believe an honest plan to eliminate their carbon emissions. Something that seemed to make sense with a
not
reasonable
greenwashing,
pace.
but a well thought through plan.
Yeah, something reasonable with a reasonable pace. It's good for their image. Other tech companies are doing the same. So I have no reason to doubt that they mean well. But AI arrived, and instead of reducing their carbon emissions over the past year or two, they have increased. Because the energy mix they have access to is not clean enough. It's a surprise. And can we justify that energy it spends right now? I don't think we can. We have the tools to solve this on the long term, 2040, 2050. But right now, it is carbon that is being emitted and is going to harm people. So yeah, anything we can do to reduce energy use today is immediately valuable, and we should make an effort.
Well, including the energy we're putting in this podcast, right? It's a very small scale, but I think about it. I think about the energy that went into making these microphones and the relationships I have with the land and the minerals, and even that's a micro scale. When we start connecting and feeling where these things come from. They come from the earth, they come from the human hands, they come from different places. It changes our relationship to them. We are more respectful, we're more able to love by slowing down and by reducing and saying, well, maybe I won't use as much energy as I have. I won't take that extra trip. And it's not out of guilt, and it's not like I'm it's like relating to the land. I was saying at this conference, instead of saving the world, some people are trying to do that. Why don't you be the world? Why don't you? And because you are made of carbon and all of the materials that are around us. We are, we will go back to the earth. And people understand that, but they don't feel it because we're very cerebral and we're very conceptual and we're so clever, we're so clever. But anyway, how do you feel, Katrine?
I was at a party the other night and I was speaking to someone who was a photographer who does large-scale photography. And, we talked a bit about climate change and he heard about my climate change background and he looked so sheepish. It was like looking at a dog that had peed on the carpet and didn't really want you to know about this. And he said, I use a lot of chemicals in my process and I feel terribly guilty about this. And I just said to him, don't worry, it's okay. It's so easy to get paralyzed. I remember one of the things that was adjacent to my my journey into climate change and feeling the start, and sometimes still now quite freaked out by it, was looking into zero waste. And Sebastian and I became really into zero waste, and we'd go to shops and we'd get everything in, and we realized at some point that we were spending a lot of time and energy, lots, into getting things zero waste. And to what, in a way? Like, does and even now, like, I was going through my fridge and I found some really scary things at the back, small jars, and I'm like, I'm not going to open these. These are going straight into a bin. I had a friend who's into very zero waste come over, and she opened my bin to put something in, saw these jars and got quite upset and took them out and washed them. And I think there was just this thing of, it's almost like a magic trick. A magician shows you, here is where the magic is happening, while the sleight of hand is happening somewhere else. I'm not saying that, trying to practice things like, trying to get things secondhand and looking after what you have, that matters. That really matters. But it's important not to get bogged down in that. I think about that as well as an oil painter. Like, I have chemicals that I work with. Is there a better way to do this? And there's some artists that have gone and said, you know what? I'm not going to be working with chemicals anymore. I'm going to be working with things I found out in the environment. Should someone who naturally wants to do photography, is a photographer. They're a photographer. Should they not be working in that way? Should they be working smaller? I don't know. It's always interesting to see how artists respond to these things. But should we be paralyzed and not make art because of that? I would say no. And also, it's a question of scale. Who's doing this? I'm seeing so many artists, bleeding hearts, freaked out, feeling terrible. Not just artists, a lot of people. And we know the story of the carbon footprint. Yes, it matters. But who was it that got us thinking about the carbon footprint? It was an oil and gas company.
Because they wanted to shift the blame.
The magic trick is happening somewhere else. Look here. Not
right.
here.
You kind of have to know about that duality, that you're being manipulated if you're being meant to feel guilty, and yet you can reduce your footprint in a way. I mean, this is where science is interesting. I was talking yesterday in French with Sarah Fioravanti, who works here in Montreal with Creative Dream, which is our series of tools for artists to measure their footprint. And the idea of measuring your footprint is just to have a baseline. To have an idea. If you're traveling a lot, if you're touring group, you just know that you're burning this much, and you say it's worth it. It's culture. It's helping diplomacy. You can not only justify it, you can explain it, and maybe it's okay because everything uses energy in one way or another. But if you have this huge footprint that you weren't aware of, you might say, I'm going to reduce it by 10% every year, and I'm going to feel good about that. I'm going to talk about my process, and I'm going to be engaged and not just a guilt-driven weird It's like I'm informed by scientific calculations and by my desire to be a better citizen and to work in the best conditions possible, and that means having as light a footprint as possible. Here in Montreal, there's a group called Ecology. They recycle, and I have an interview with Katrine Lebeau in French again about their efforts to recycle theater sets. And it's a relatively small footprint, but it's incredibly impactful for the people involved because they talk to each other and they realize that you don't have to take virgin when use a set for 3 weeks and put it in the garbage.
The amount of waste is amazing. But there's this thing of something that's always haunted me in when I've said, okay, there's bigger things here and the magic trick is happening somewhere else, like stop worrying. You I would never say stop worrying about your carbon footprint, but there's two things to hold in one hand here. One is this saying, I don't know where it's from, which is every snowflake in an avalanche pleads innocence. And I think about that all the time. The other thing I think about is things that happen, for example, in a religion where you practice something which perhaps doesn't make sense right now, but points to something else. So when we were doing the zero waste thing at the way we were doing it, I found we would bump into people or find a little street that we hadn't gone to or find some new recipe. So there was something in that practice that took us somewhere else as well, which was interesting. But the scale is important as well. Like, maybe we also need to realize that just by doing our own little bit in our lives actually isn't enough, and we do need to get collaborative, which is scary for a lot of artists, particularly artists that are not musicians, that are not actors, that are artists that studied fine art and have their own little practices. And I think how fine art, I don't know what it would be here in Canada, Beaux-Arts, whatever, is taught is really not helpful for climate change and beyond.
Well, that's why we created an organization a few years ago called SCALE,
Exactly.
Sexual Climate Arts Leadership. And I had an interview last week with Annette Hagel, who runs that organization out of Ottawa. And that's one of many initiatives to get artists to talk to each other, to work together, to realize that collectively we have a voice, not only through our art, but as citizens and as cultural workers.
Yeah.
You know, what do we want in terms of policies from our government, local, municipal, provincial, federal, even at the COPs. There were many Canadian artists who went to COP 28 and asked for culture to be included, and it was a global effort, but it is going to be out in COP 30. So those kinds of things are major, because we know that the arts and culture are very powerful in shaping people's minds,
We can't renewable energy our way out of this problem. No. We can't. It's a philosophical change. It's a totally different way of living that we're going to have, and artists will play a role to lead in that if they step up into the challenge, if they step up into their greatness. And a lot of us can't, won't, are afraid. And when one of the things we were talking about is artist as shaman, but I think we need to also talk about artist as leader. You're talking about people feeling powerful, not in a puffed up powerful way, but truly, quietly powerful.
Well, we're going to end this conversation because there's already been 30 minutes or so. I'm getting tired. Go home. About leadership. It's a big topic. There's a panel in a couple of weeks in Toronto on cultural leadership that I'm sponsoring through my my podcast, and I'm interested in the notion of cultural leadership, not in the conventional sense of the individual leading the way, but how can a leader, somebody who knows that they have a talent or a certain power base, how can they use that to help shape movements and shape people working together and changing their ways, So what's climate art leadership to you? I think you just answered it earlier.
Yeah, I think authenticity comes to mind, but I was in that place of thinking, I can't do anything, I can't say anything because I don't have a science background. So I went and got my science background, and it turns out the answer wasn't there. The answer was inside me all along. The answer, to be able to do something, to be able to affect change. I don't like the way that's phrased, but it was never through the science degree, and it was never going to be that.
But what if you did an MBA? Would you magically be a leader then?
100% not. I think that is the worst degree that anyone could ever do. Apologies.
Well,
no, there's studies.
No, the question of leadership is not an area of
Mm-hmm.
expertise of mine. You know, I've seen really good leaders who were very collaborative and good listeners.
Those are the best ones, right?
Empathetic and all that kind of thing. But climate art leadership is a very specific thing, and the course that this is what connects us, right?
Yes.
That Julie's Bicycle developed, and it's a very good course. It has its failings, but it's more than well intended. It's a curriculum that's useful for many people.
And it recognizes the need for that.
Plus, they're creating alumni and networking,
Right.
which is how we met, you know.
Yes.
And I met a colleague from Ethiopia, and I'm going to talk to him about his experience with locust plagues in Ethiopia and the kind of artwork that's happening around there. And these stories need to be heard, they need to be discussed. So we'll get back to leadership. I don't think we're going to resolve it all tonight. Do you have thoughts on leadership, Sebastian? I bet you do. Or lack thereof.
I wish to see more interdisciplinary work. I see wonderful leaders who are working in silos, and they don't spend the time to see what's happening in other silos. Have people working on the cultural changes that will be necessary to adapt to climate change and to change the system of incentives we live under that kind of forces us to be extractive and destructive. So that's a huge part of the puzzle. You have people who work on the science, people who work purely on communications, people who work on technological solutions, and I don't see these people talking much, and they often ignore the insights that are clear to others, and they end up being fairly inefficient, I would say. They chase false solutions sometimes. They imagine problems, they ignore problems. I would really like to see a more composite group that includes all of these facets, because we're going to need all the tools in our toolbox to face this, because it's a complex problem and it requires a lot of brains with different insights.
When I was at the Canada Council, one of the things that kept coming up is have artists at the table of decisions, and to have artists contribute further through their art and through their leadership. And maybe that's the kind of leadership we're looking at, all the skills that artists can bring to not just solutions, but different perspectives, allegory, illusion, dreaming, all the language and the things that artists bring that don't necessarily come from others.
Right.
And, if you think of the Václav Havels of the world, artists and poets and theater people who became politicians, who took political leadership roles with their artistic background, that maybe we need more of that as well for artists. And I know there's many examples in Canada and abroad of artists who stepped up and play hybrid roles. They're artists and they're political leaders. And maybe they're political leaders who then also use art as a way to express themselves. It's just the isolation that we've created of specialty. So when you say interdisciplinary, I'm hearing also cross-sectoral.
Right, exactly.
Interdisciplinary, cross-sectoral, all of those kinds. And partially that the blockages come from the way we've been trained and through these silos. And of course, if you're having, if you have a brain problem, you want a brain surgeon to look after that kind of thing. I get that. And some artists are better than others. I think that's fine too. But they can learn from each other, they can have conversations and have the kind of dialogue that will lead to new methodologies, new collaborative ways, new territorial...
Well, that's one of the things Seb and I were talking about earlier today, was looking at AI, looking at computers, and how artists were making things that precipitated these things or talked to these things happening in technology at the same time, often earlier. Paintings that... what were we talking about exactly? Was it AI or was it just computing in general? Computing in general, yeah. It was just really interesting to see. But one thing I think I see a lot of, we talk about art and science connecting or collaborative or interdisciplinary work. And I find often, and this is something that I think it was David Maddox of The Nature of Cities. It's a New York-based magazine which looks at nature in cities and all its weird, wonderful wildness. He brings together scientists, artists, writers, theatre people, everyone under the sun. and creates this wild, wacky thing, which is called the nature of cities. He said, often when artists and scientists are brought together, the art serves the science. It does not often go the other way around. And look around again and again and again and again, and you see artists making art from what scientists have done, or they call it collaboration, but really it's art. Serving, or usually actually just illustrating science, and it makes for very dull work.
And what is missing on the other way around? What?
A conversation,
Right.
right? Truly interdisciplinary work is heart-stoppingly exciting and amazing and magical and enchanting and everything, and moves you forward and picks you up and takes us all on a wave, but one serving the other in that way, but it's not truly a conversation, falls flat, heavily flat.
Well, in this iteration of Brave New Waves on the non-CBC podcast of my conscient brain, I've really enjoyed this exploration of art and science and technology and all of these interconnected fields. And I think people will agree generally that we need to be interconnected and better collaborative. But I've heard that for many years. I think looking at the silos, and you're a scientist, Sébastian, you see them, you feel them, but I'm seeing a lot of change, and technology has helped, right? Because the knowledge is more easily, it's more mobile. And people are being trained differently. The young people I see are not going into silos. They're very fluid. They're they talk about, in the same breath, they talk about very interconnected issues in new ways. So that's very hopeful. And that's normal. It's like they're educated in a digital world that is much more fluid. It's also dangerous because there's a lot of misinformation and manipulation. But that's always been there. It's just amplified by the fact that the internet's so frickin' fast. That's really the difference. Is that and we can't. It's going so fast that we don't have time to correct and to bring the ethical lens and say, this is not true. This is sort of true, and this is we verified this and all that. I'm not an expert in any of this, but I love to talk about it with people like you because you have a lot of experience, both in art and in science. And if the listener can get something out of it, then I'm happy. If you can and so let's get to the end of this conversation, which is the things that you're reading or seeing. You've already given a couple of things that I'll put in the episode notes if I remember to do that. But I think I will, because when I listen, I make notes and I say, they said this and that. So we'll start with Katrine. What do you recommend people read, see, that you have found very stimulating and helpful?
I think go and get a big picture book out of your local library of cave paintings. Go and have a look at what people all over the world are showing us through the stone, through rock engravings, through pieces of charcoal and ochre, and how they're talking to us. They lived in a world which might look something like our own, and I think they also have this, not to romanticize it, but there are ways of living there that are collaborative in a way we don't really understand today, ways of using materials, ways of being. So yeah, I know it's maybe not a book about climate change, and there's a lot of brilliant ones, like I could name a list, but maybe go check that out. There's the Earth Children series. It's a book about a time when Neanderthals and humans lived on Earth at the same time. And I cannot tell you exactly why I'm recommending that, but I read it recently and it really resonated with me with all the thinking I'm doing with climate change. And the other thing I'd like to recommend is an Instagram account called Nature Is Not Metal. And I think it just speaks to the weird, the wild, the wonderful, the enchanting, the magical, the tragic of how we are capturing nature as it is right now in the world. And I think reading the comments, looking at people who interact with that is a really interesting look at maybe a temperature check on how we are with nature right now. So those two probably slightly stranger sources, but that's what I'd recommend. Handing over to Sebastian.
An idea would be, so this is from someone who works in technology to people who are less familiar with this, the concept of S-curve. this is a way to understand technological transitions. Sorry, technological transitions. This is what happens with a number of technological innovations. It has happened all over the 20th century, with phones, landline phones, cell phones, automobiles, microwaves, I think. It shows us how fast change can come if the conditions are right. And it happens a lot right now in the energy transition. This is the core of this. You can't understand the energy transition if you don't understand S-curves. And also it helps people delineate what's a relatively easy problem to solve. As soon as a problem can be described in this way, it is relatively easy because it's unavoidable. We can accelerate it, but it's going to happen. This is one class of problem. Problems that do not have an S-curve, that do not correspond to a transition of this kind, are the hardest ones. And those are the problems that need more support. So people need to be informed about what those problems are, and pressure their politicians and make things happen.
What is an S-curve? Like
essentially,
S as in the letter?
It's technically it's a logistic curve. It's a curve of adoption.
Okay.
It says essentially this new technology is getting adopted slowly, until a certain point.
A threshold.
A threshold where it becomes competitive, and it almost immediately, within a few years, replaces the previous technology. Okay. So a car replaces a horse. Right. And right now, solar is replacing coal. Mm-hmm. So this is going to happen. It's inevitable. EVs, electric cars, are going to make oil obsolete.
Unless we get rid of cars.
Right, which would be even...
First prize.
First prize. So I'm talking about the worst case scenario. But say cement, aviation, agriculture maybe, those are harder problems, and we need people to get involved.
And
collaborate, find solutions together, and those include cultural work. What stories do we say about food? This matters.
And I'll ask you one last question. Does slowing down ever come up as a solution in your world?
Slowing down?
Mm-hmm.
No. It is considered to be unrealistic.
Unrealistic to capitalism, or I'm giving you a hard time here?
It's a matter of timeline. It is believed in my sphere of professional sphere that cultural change can happen, but the timeline we're working with is 10 years, and we don't have time to force certain kinds of solution within 10 years.
But 10 years to save what? To save the existing world, or to build a new world? I mean, again, I'm giving you a hard time.
We are... It is hard. It is a hard question.
I don't think it has a single answer.
We need to stop the fire first.
Right.
Limit the damage within the next 10 years. Right. And then we can think about creating a new world that's better for everyone.
I buy that. That's why I use the term slowing down, but it doesn't necessarily... Slowing down is like stopping the abusive behavior that reduces the chances of our finding the longer term solutions.
Right.
So, it could be reducing the amount of energy we use, like the carbon budget. There's a woman named Angelia Padurai in Vancouver I talked to you about earlier. The first time I heard about the climate budget, like the amount of carbon budgets are not climate budget. Yeah. I had never heard that concept before until like 4 years ago. And I'm pretty informed. So there's a lot of things that we don't know, and they're really interesting measures. Like, there's only so much carbon that we can use before we're into this, whatever you want to call it, over the threshold. And so that precious resource that won't come back in the short term, I find it's like, it's not that you want to spend it like money, it's like you want to increase it. You want to say, we're losing our capacity to live on the planet, and what can we do to build back that capacity to breathe and to live on the planet, right? Why aren't we thinking that way, Katrina?
As opposed to?
As opposed to what we're doing now, which is just continually burning the resources that are not, that are destructive. You know, you think of the tipping points that are coming in the Arctic and other
Well,
places.
this is what Sebastian's talking about, I think, as well. Like, TikTok, you know, and I think there's an urgency to it right now that there's always been an urgency to it, but I think it's been communicated at a policy level, and we have
You're not talking about social media here, you're talking about the clock?
Not the clock, the actual clock. I know, another expression. Not the tick, the time, yeah. Earlier we were talking about the difference between, some people look at this as a dying planet, and some people, and is this a new world? Is the world dying, or are we giving birth to a new world? And what is our role? Are we death doulas, or are we midwives?
Beautiful,
right?
I
there
love
it
that.
is. And do we change between both of them? And I would say, man, if you had a choice between being a death doula and being a midwife, be a midwife, because in every birth there is a death. There's that T.S. Eliot poem, The Coming of the Magi, and they, you know, it's three wise men going to the birth of Jesus, and one of the lines is, I had seen birth and death, and I'm not quoting directly, I'd seen birth and death and thought they were different, but this birth felt like a death to me. And there was something in that of these two things, again, like art and science, when they come together in their purest, finest forms, they are not so different. And we are in trouble when we think that they are as artists. There's a scene in Lord of the Rings, Sebastian is going to kill me because I'm going to butcher all the names here, but a man is building a funeral pyre for his son who he thinks is dead, and everyone's going, your son's not dead, and he keeps pouring on oil and weeping, crying, navel, you know what I mean, building this thing for this child that is not dead. And because he cannot see that his child is dead, he keeps on putting on wood and crying and weeping, and he's in himself, and in that way that he is, he fails to see his son's hand twitching, he fails to see his eyelids fluttering, and he just keeps building that funeral pyre. And I am not there. I don't want to be there. I don't want anyone to be there. We do need to mourn. We do. It's exhausting not to. It doesn't feel real not to. We know that thing of, I don't know, it feels like cheerful group. We all have there's cheerful corporate speak around this, which is just exhausting and doesn't feel real. And when we're talking about hope and the future, a lot of that stuff doesn't ring real either. I think communicators have failed on very many levels, but yeah, anyway.
Well, I'm glad you raised the death doula
midwife
story, because to me it's not a metaphor, it's just like a duality, right? It could be both, could be neither, but anyway, we'll leave it at that, because our listeners are as tired as we are, because there's so many,
and they haven't even had as much dandelion wine. Well,
the dandelion wine was quite nice. I like the fact that it's a mead type process of but we've had dandelion wine, and you know, my nostalgia for the Brave New Waves era is really about open-ended conversations that can go on. Like in Ottawa, I've mentioned this a few times in the podcast, and I do open an invitation to people in Ottawa, or people who want to come to Ottawa, every second month, every 2 months, every second Wednesday, we're going to have a gathering of art and ecology people in our house, you know, as many people as we can fit. And it was difficult during COVID, but it's easier now. And I think, and I continue to invite people to think about doing that in the simplest way possible. To say, we're doing a potluck, try to bring organic food if you can, bring whatever food you want to share, talk about whatever you want. If you're sad, maybe somebody will help you. If you're joyful, it might help others. If you're doing an art project, bring a sample, whatever it is. And we miss that, because what you get from that is this resonance and resilience and solidarity amongst artists, amongst like-minded people, and then maybe you'll have somebody who disagrees, and then you'll, like with Sébastian earlier, you know, you get somebody who turns you around, and maybe I turned you around a little bit too, right? Just a little bit. And that dialogue and that sense of togetherness and without being too dramatic about it, I think is missing everywhere.
Everywhere.
Because we're living on our phones, and so let's gather.
Yeah, and I love what you also said about this being, you know, when you're talking about radio, it comes and it goes. Someone was listening at 4 a.m. or 3 a.m. and if they heard it, they heard it, and if they didn't, they didn't. And I love that as well, where it's quite something being recorded all the time wherever you are, being photographed all the time wherever you are, even if you're photographing yourself. It's one of the things I'll always take away from the Julie's Bicycle climate leadership thing that we met at was someone said, one of the moderators said, come raggedy. Come even when you're raggedy. Come ye raggedy. I love that.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Claude. Lovely to meet you.